Marijuana Prohibition, Part 3. Scott Pearce.
It's time for us to turn our attentions to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Those of you who are looking for government-industrial conspiracy theories, as opposed to the usual fare of political horse trading and compromise, will find this to be the most thought-provoking section of this presentation. Up until now, we've seen how the marijuana prohibition movement fit into the larger social concerns about government control of the commercial use of intoxicants. Until this part of our story, everything has transpired out in the open. Now, part of our narrative takes place behind closed doors. That doesn't mean that plenty of important action didn't happen in public. Let's look at that part first. The most famous person behind this law is the Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry J. Anslinger. I think he deserves plenty of blame for the bad consequences of American marijuana policy. Let's review the medical testimony presented during the congressional hearings on the Marijuana Tax Act. Dr. William C. Woodward, a physician who was chief counsel for the American Medical Association, sent a letter to the committee that was placed in the record, and he testified in person. Here's a quote from the letter. Quote, "There is no evidence that the medical use of these drugs has caused or is causing cannabis addiction. As remedial agents, they are used to an inconsiderable extent, and the obvious purpose and effect of this bill is to impose so many restrictions on their use as to prevent such use altogether. Since the medicinal use of cannabis has not caused and is not causing addiction, the prevention of the use of the drug for medicinal purposes can accomplish no good end whatsoever." Close quote. Dr. Woodward's live testimony is fascinating. He argued that the committee has relied on newspaper accounts of marijuana instead of using what he calls competent primary evidence. Here is the relevant section of his testimony. Quote, "We are told that the use of marijuana causes crime, but yet no one has been produced from the Bureau of Prisons to show the number of prisoners who have been found addicted to the marijuana habit. An informal inquiry shows that the Bureau of Prisons has no evidence on that point. We have been told that school children are great users of marijuana cigarettes. No one has been summoned from the Children's Bureau to show the nature and extent of the habit among children. Inquiry of the Office of Education indicates that they have had no occasion to investigate and know nothing of it." Close quote. After some give and take with the committee, the chairman tells the doctor, quote, "If you want to advise us on legislation, you ought to come here with some constructive proposals rather than criticism, rather than trying to place obstacles in the way of something the federal government is trying to do." Close quote. The doctor replies, quote, "We cannot understand yet, Mr. Chairman, why this bill should have been prepared in secret for 2 years without any intimation, even to the profession, that it was being prepared." Close quote. This is evidence to support the anti-hemp industrial conspiracy theory. There were secret hearings that apparently lasted a lot longer than the official public ones. Dr. W. A. Treadway of the Public Health Service, Division of Mental Hygiene, answered in writing questions submitted to him by the committee. A couple of the points he makes are worthy of note. First, he indicates that the active ingredient of cannabis has not yet been isolated. Next, he says that medicine from cannabis, quote, "has been employed since about 500 BC, close quote. He adds that it has been in each revision of the pharmacopoeia, but that its use in medicine is rare now, and so it may be dropped from the book. Finally, he writes, quote, "Cannabis indica does not produce a dependence such as an opiate addiction. As to the social or moral degradation associated with cannabis, it probably belongs in the same category as alcohol. Marijuana is habit-forming, although not addicting in the same sense as alcohol might be with some people, or sugar, or coffee." Close quote. Dr. James Munch, a PhD, not a medical doctor, from Temple University, was the only scientist who told the committee what it wanted to hear. Depending on your point of view, his testimony is either funny or depressing. Dr. Munch testified that he is a professor of pharmacology and that he has been interested in the work of the Narcotics Bureau, quote, particularly in the detection of the doping of racehorses, close quote. The professor testifies that, quote, continued use will tend to cause the degeneration of one part of the brain, that part that is useful for higher reasoning, of the memory, close quote. No studies or other evidence were offered to support this claim. It gets worse. When asked about the specifics of how the brain is damaged, the doctor replies, quote, I can only speak from my knowledge of animals, close quote. A congressman asks him, have you experimented on any animal whose reaction to this drug would be similar to that of human beings? Answer, quote, the reason we use dogs is because the reaction of dogs to this drug closely resembles the reaction of human beings, close quote. The next question was, quote, and the continued use of it, as you have observed the reaction on dogs, is also the disintegration of personality? Answer, quote, yes, so far as I can tell, not being a dog psychologist, close quote. This man, Dr. James A. Munch, was appointed official expert on marijuana by Commissioner Anslinger, probably because he was the only scientist who supported the Marijuana Tax Act. Representatives of industrial uses of hemp testified at the congressional hearings too. A quick look at their testimony is very instructive. Raymond Scarlett represented the seed industry. He testified that hemp seed is a necessary and irreplaceable ingredient in pigeon feeds because it brings back the feathers and improves the birds. Scarlett didn't even know hemp seed and marijuana were related until a week before his testimony. The most interesting part of Scarlett's testimony is found in questions asked by Congressman Reed, who doesn't understand that common field hemp and marijuana are the same plant. The birdseed people got, and retain, an exemption from the Marijuana Tax Act, which allowed them to use denatured, sterilized seeds. Ralph Lozier spoke as representative of the National Institute of Oilseed Products. He testified that almost 47 million pounds of hemp oil and seed imported into the USA in the previous 3 years were used primarily in paints, soap, and linoleum. Here's where there's more evidence of conspiracy. Representatives of the DuPont Company gave secret testimony directly to Herman Oliphant, the chief counsel to the Treasury Department. They said DuPont could create and provide synthetic petrochemical replacements for hemp seed oil. Mr. Oliphant was the man who wrote the Marijuana Tax Act. The final punchline from the Marijuana Tax Act comes from its trip through the House of Representatives. The only remaining question on the floor of the House was whether or not the AMA had voiced an opinion about the bill. As you know, the AMA was against it. Dr. Woodward's July 10, 1937 letter put it nicely, quote, since the medicinal uses of cannabis has not caused and is not causing addiction, the prevention of the use of the drug for medicinal purposes can accomplish no good end whatsoever, close quote. Representative Fred Vincent stepped forward to answer the AMA question. He indicated, incorrectly, that the bill has the full support of the AMA. A few years later, President Harry Truman appointed Mr. Vincent Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The House passed the bill as amended by the Senate, and President Franklin Roosevelt signed it into law. And that's how the United States got stuck with its federal anti-marijuana legislation. The story speaks for itself. The law was drafted in secret and rushed through Congress in a sloppy, stupid, and corrupt way.
This is a production of Nuclear Podcasting. Creative Commons, Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives.